I recently had the good fortune to go on a course through bronzeagefoundry.com to craft a replica bronze short sword from around 1200 BC. The course was excellent and run by a chap called Dave, and everyone on it was particularly pleased with the results. They were also kind enough to let me film it so I could take you through the process. There'll be a link to their website in the description if you're interested in going on the course. As I've just been on it, I can honestly say it was a wonderful weekend. I highly recommend it. So the process begins in the foundry, which, as you can see, is all done using modern equipment. This is because it's a weekend course and it took all weekend to make the swords anyway. Using ancient equipment, it would have taken far longer. So this is the forge in which the bronze will be melted. It's heated by blowing propane in with an electric motor that also pushes air in to make sure there's a steady airflow. This beautiful green flame is because of residual copper in the furnace. Bronze is a mixture of copper and tin, and the copper is measured out into wired bundles. These are heated over this flame first to remove any impurities, to make sure there's no water on there for any reason, or that maybe an insect or a spider had crawled into the bundle while you weren't looking. This is not just to keep impurities out of your sword, but because water expands when it becomes very hot, and it can cause all sorts of problems with the actual mixture itself, such as air pockets and whatnot. You obviously want the alloy to be as pure as possible when you're creating it. Once cleaned, the copper is then lowered down into a ceramic jug that's already in the forge. Once all the copper is purified and put into the forge to melt, a preheated mould is set up. The mould is made out of soapstone because it's particularly heat resistant and won't crack when introduced to the incredibly hot molten bronze, which, if I recall correctly, comes out at around 1200 degrees Celsius. The mould is pinned together to make sure that both sides accurately line up, and you can see that there's a hole in the top into which the molten bronze will be poured. Once this is all done and the copper's melted, the small ingot of tin is added to the mixture. Tin melts at 231.9 degrees Celsius, so it melts almost instantly. And the mixture is about 12.5% tin and the rest copper. This means that the sword is strong and hard, but not too brittle. After a short period of time, the air supply is turned off, and you can see the flame return to a normal gas flame. And then the mixture is ready to be removed from the forge. Before being removed, a small pot of ground charcoal is added to deoxidize the mixture. And then it's ready to be removed. White hot, as you can see. This is then poured directly into the mould. Doesn't that just look amazing? Because that's so nice to watch, I'll play it again from a different angle, and I'll leave the sound on so you can hear what it was like. The recording gets rather loud after this point, so I'm turning the volume down again. But you can see how the bronze is cooling quite rapidly in the mould. Once it loses its red glow, it's ready to be removed from the mould, and there you have it, a freshly cast bronze sword. As you can see, when it first comes out, it looks like it might well be an ancient blade itself, and this is the origin of the legend of the sword in the stone and the sort of mythological meme associated with it. I actually had the first sword that was cast that day, and the first thing you have to do when you take it out is to remove the end knob from the tang, and you do that via the use of a hacksaw. Once that's complete, what you have to do is remove all the extraneous metal from around the blade, because bronze isn't forged in the same way as you would think a iron or steel sword would be, sort of hammered on the forge or anything like that. Bronze is cast. And so once it's been cast into the mould and you've taken it out, you then are effectively taking away metal to bring the correct shape and proportions out of the weapon. This took around half an hour. It wasn't the most thrilling thing in the world, but it was obviously necessary. And of course, any bronze taken off was put aside because you can simply just remelt it and use it again, with absolutely no loss of quality. After all the extraneous pieces have been picked off, the blade shape is then finished with an angle grinder. Again, in ancient times this would be done laboriously by hand. We didn't have that sort of time. I've also slightly rearranged the order in which the next few clips actually happened, just because there was a waiting time. As there was a group of about 6 or 7 of us, and you had to continue to work while you were waiting. So the angle grinder was used to create the shape of the blade that you were going to use, and it looks like it's being sharpened here, but it's not really. Afterwards, holes were drilled in the tang through which the copper pins that would hold the wooden handle would be placed. Again, this was all done using modern machinery for the sake of time. Next you need to create the handle, and that's done by heating up the tang of the sword, by basically blowtorching it, as you can see here. Now this is done for a while, until it's good and hot. You then take the 2 evenly cut pieces of wood that are going to form the handle, and put them on a vise. Once that's all set up as you want, you take the now very, very hot sword, and when the tang is glowing red hot, you take it and place it between the 2 blocks, so that the diamond shape of the pommel is within the blocks, and then you press them together very hard using the vise. This brands the shape of the tang into the wood, so you can affix it later, after you've carved the shape of the handle out of it. Although the blade looks like it's been burnt from the heat, this just rubs off with a file. It's really not difficult to remove, and it doesn't seem to damage the blade in any permanent way that I can tell. You might be thinking, well, this blade looks a little bit more shiny than it did when we last saw it, and that's because, as I said, I've skipped ahead slightly just to give you a more sensible chronology of events. If you were making the sword on your own, this is how you'd do it. So in between all of these steps and proceeding on after them was the endless task of filing. What you would do is clamp the sword to the workbench, you would get yourself a sharp file, and you would begin filing the blade back and forth for the entire day until you ran out of daylight, and then you would carry on the next day, slowly but surely polishing off the roughness of the blade until it became quite shiny. You would of course have to do this for the whole blade, including parts of the tang where the handle would be attached, until you had filed off any of the imperfections that you can see here on the blade, the very small dark marks. You would of course have to do this for both sides of the blade, and it was very labour intensive. By the end of the weekend I felt like I'd spent the entire weekend in the gym. But how beautiful does the blade look so far? As I said, this effectively took all day because you had to really grind down to get out any very tiny pits you would see on the blade, and the more you worked, the more you'd see, and you would literally just have to wear down the blade to get rid of them. Once you'd removed all the rough marks, you were left with a blade that was very shiny but also very, very scratched. And to remove these scratches, you then had to break out the sandpaper. So to start with, you'd remove the deepest of the scratches with a fairly light file. And then you would move up through various gradients of sandpaper until you eventually came to sandpaper so fine you couldn't see the grain, and then wire wool, until you produced a beautifully shone and almost mirror-edged blade. As with the initial filing, this took a very long time. But personally I think it was completely worth it, and the sense of satisfaction I had after polishing the blade to this level was really quite intense. Now you can see some remaining scratches, but that's where the light's catching them. They're actually very, very tiny. Once the blade was polished, the handle was attached using copper pins after being cut to shape. These were simply hammered in and flattened like rivets. And then the handle was roughly shaped using the sander and the angle grinder. These were again done as a time-saving method because it would have taken all day to have carved this by hand. It even took quite a long time with the angle grinder, cutting the handle down to what was roughly the right shape. Once that was done, you'd finish the general shape of the handle using a tool called a rasp, which is exactly as it sounds. It's just a very rough piece of metal that shears off chunks of wood. You'd then change to a fairly rough file to complete the shape, and finish the handle off with sandpaper so it looks something like this. You'd then get some Brasso to polish up the blade, and it was pretty good. I mean, it probably could have been better, but it was almost a mirror finish, to the point where I could see my face and the reflection of the camera in the blade. It felt really good to get to this point, because there was a lot of hard work to get there. You then had to put an edge on the blade, which I have to say I really didn't want to do at this point, because after spending an entire day polishing it up and getting rid of every single tiny scratch on it, and you were really diligent about the tiniest of scratches, to then take a file to it and start scratching it was just anathema. But you did it by holding the file at a steep angle, obviously not touching the actual blade, but just the very edge, and then just grinding away the metal on both sides until it formed a sharp ridge. Now, I'm no metallurgist, so I don't really know anything about this, but I personally was of the opinion that this got very sharp. I mean, my hands were covered in cuts before I'd even finished sharpening it, and while sharpening it, I cut my hands several times. And finally, we painted the handle with linseed oil, both to dye it and to protect it against the elements. You had to really get right in to the corners. But it really gave it a lovely finish, and it smells lovely as well. And after the swords were finished, there were of course people who wanted to test them out. Thanks. We're in this together. Yeah! And so that was it. The swords were all done except for one thing. The sword, of course, had to be named and dedicated to a god. So I took what alcohol I had, which was the remnants of a bottle of Southern Comfort, and I decided to dedicate my blade to Asher, the Lord of Heaven and the god of the Assyrians. So I took my drink and poured a libation on the floor and on the blade to honour the god. I named it, and then I plunged it into the water. As I am told I had to do. And so I am now the proud owner of a replica of an Irish bronze sword that was originally made around 1200 BC and found in a peat bog, which found its way to the Ashmolean, which is where Dave got the measurements from. And I purchased a scabbard for it because I needed some way of safely getting it home, because it was very sharp. It was an amazing weekend, and I really enjoyed it. It was a lot of hard work, but it was so worth it. I've left links in the description, so if you have any interest in doing this yourself, you can contact them and go ahead. And I do hope that Asher is pleased with my dedication. So this is the sword and the scabbard I purchased. You'll notice the blade's a bit more dull than it was in the video earlier because the scabbard's wiped off all the Brasso. The blade is of course leaf-shaped and 18 inches long, and just shy of 22 inches when you include the hilt. And it weighs 1 pound and 8 ounces. And I'd like to thank everyone at Bronze Age Foundry, as well as the other people participating on the course. Everyone was lovely, the whole thing was very professional, the food and accommodation were fantastic. The only gripe I have is that it's in the middle of deepest, darkest Wales, where there's no internet connection. But that one minor problem is not enough to stop me from thoroughly recommending this to anyone who thinks they might be interested. Thanks very much for watching.